about how life on Earth had evolved over the past 3.8 billion years, bringing us to the evolution of our human ancestors, the Homo sapiens species, who first showed up in the anthropological records about 200,000 years ago. In this presentation, I plan to briefly describe the migrations of humans out of Africa about 60,000 years ago, and the diasporas which eventually populated all the continents except Antarctica with the descendants of these African migrants. As our ancient ancestors spread, first to Australia, and then to Central Asia, Europe, East Asia, Siberia, and finally to North and South America, they faced different and hostile environments and adapted to them through genetic change, natural selection, and cultural modifications. This evolutionary process of genetic change didn't stop 20 to 30,000 years ago, as many people believe, but the scientific evidence strongly suggests that we're continuing to evolve and that our human nature is dynamic, not static. The fact that human evolution has been recent, copious, and regional is not widely recognized, even though it's now been reported by many research articles in the genetics literature. Today I plan to cover the 4 topics on this next slide. The 4th item relates to the major drivers of genetic change and the impact of such change on world social structures, in other words, cultures, on institutions, and on race. This latter point is controversial among many social scientists, whose official view is designed to support the political view that genetics cannot possibly be the reason why human societies are different. One reason for this view is the understandable fear that exploration of genetic differences will give support to racism and will lead to attitudes about eugenics, such as occurred in Nazi Germany and some other countries during World War II. Another reason is the inherent inertia of the academic world, where scholars continually check each other's work, especially on grant applications. Some social scientists get attached to the view of their field that they grew up with, and as they grow older, they may gain the influence to resist change. As economist Paul Samuelson once observed, knowledge advances, funeral by funeral. While some of these perspectives on the relationship between genetics, social behavior, culture, and race are speculative, and hard evidence from genome research has not yet identified the responsible genes, I'll try to summarize such views because they provide a critical understanding of who we are and why we act like we do. My principal sources of genetics information are the 3 books by Nicholas Wade shown on this slide. Wade received a BA in Natural Sciences from King's College, Cambridge, and he's held the editorial position shown here on this slide. I especially like the clarity of the writing style of Wade, the fact that he provides opposing views on the many controversial issues described here, and that he's informed by so much research and so many references in each of his books. For example, his 2nd book up here, The Faith Instinct, includes 326 references, and that's a lot of source information. All humans alive today are descendants of the first Homo sapiens, who initially ventured out of Africa some 60,000 years ago and left genetic footprints still visible today. By mapping the appearance and frequency of genetic markers in modern people, population geneticists create a picture of when and where ancient humans moved around the world. These great migrations eventually led the descendants of a small group of Africans to occupy even the farthest parts of the earth. Our species is an African one. Africa is where we humans first evolved and where we have spent the majority of our time on Earth. The earliest fossils of recognizable modern Homo sapiens appear in the fossil records in Ethiopia about 200,000 years ago. Although earlier fossils may be found over the coming years, This is our best understanding of when and approximately where modern humans originated. Using mitochondrial DNA from over 500,000 people, this is a recent map of the migration paths of women out of Africa, starting with the so-called Eve in East Central Africa. Here's Eve. Eve is the genetic mother of all people alive today, no matter where they live. The migration paths of men look much the same, as you would expect because the men and women travel together. The letters on the map represent different groups that migrated from Africa at different times and spread out from there. According to the genetic and paleontological record, we only started to leave Africa between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago. What set this in motion is uncertain, but scientists think it has something to do with major climatic shifts that were happening around that time. A sudden cooling in the Earth's climate, driven by the onset of one of the worst parts of the last ice age. This cold snap would have made life difficult for our African ancestors, and the genetic evidence points to a sharp reduction in population size about that time. In fact, the human population likely dropped to fewer than 10,000 people. We were holding on by a thread. Once the climate started to improve about 70,000 years ago, we came back from this near extinction event. The population expanded, and some intrepid explorers ventured beyond Africa in one or a few groups that might have ranged from 150 to 500 people in size. The earliest people to colonize the Eurasian landmass likely did so by crossing the southern end of the Red Sea across a strait separating present-day Yemen from the northeast tip of Africa. These early beachcombers expanded rapidly along the coast to India and reached Southeast Asia and Australia by 50,000 years ago. This is the M group on the map. These wanderers became the Aborigines of Australia and New Guinea, and they changed very little over the centuries before European explorers arrived in the 16th century. About 50,000 years ago, a second group appears to have set out on an inland trek, leaving behind the certainties of life in the tropics to head out into the Middle East and South Central Asia. From these base camps, they were poised to colonize the northern latitudes of Asia, Europe, and beyond. This map shows how the African migrations populated each of these geographic areas. As part of the National Genographics Project, I had my own DNA tested in 2007, and this map shows the migration pattern of my paternal ancestors from Adam in East Central Africa to the steppes of Central Asia, and then into Western Europe, as shown by the R1b line. Other branches of the R group moved into Russia, Northern Europe, and Northern India. Like Eve, Adam is the genetic father of all people alive in the world today, including those whose ancestors never left Africa. To illustrate some key genetic information, I'm going to be showing you several references to my DNA results because I have that data readily available and it's useful in making some important points. By the end of this talk, you may know a lot more about my ancestral history than you ever wanted to know. As an interesting side note, Neanderthals split from our Homo sapien lineage about 500,000 years ago and populated parts of the large Eurasian landmass. As the second wave of Homo sapiens were migrating out of Africa about 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals were still alive across Eurasia. It seems from very recent DNA research that our ancestors met and some mated with these hominine cousins, leaving a small genetic trace of these ancient relatives in our DNA. Out of curiosity, I just had my DNA tested again in early August to get more information about my ancestors, including whether or not I carry some Neanderthal genes. As a matter of record, an average of 2.1% of human genes tested to date can be traced to Neanderthal ancestors. My latest DNA test showed 2.3% Neanderthal genes, about 10% higher than the overall average. I've told my children and kinfolks that probably means our ancient ancestors were more lovers than fighters. You can imagine the response I got on that. With that historical background on human migration, let's turn to the hard science part of this talk. This involves recent genetics research, which resulted in mapping the entire human genome for the first time a decade ago. Everyone in the world has the same set of genes, although we all have many variations of these genes which give rise to our different individual traits. We'll get into that in a moment, but first here are some of the principal findings of this very recent genetics research. It's taken from the reference sources of Nicholas Wade, whose books I described earlier. There is clear continuity between the ape world of 5 million years ago and the human world that has emerged from it. While it's evident enough in the physical resemblance between the two species, the thread is most evident at the DNA level, where the genomes of humans and chimpanzees are 98 to 99% identical. That fact alone should make it obvious that very small differences in the genome make a big difference in appearance and in social behaviors over thousands or millions of years. A principal force in the shaping of human evolution has been the nature of human society. After splitting from the apes about 5 million years ago, those in the human line of descent evolved upright stature and developed dark skin in place of the ape's body hair. But the most significant change, a steady increase in brain size, probably evolved in response to the most critical aspect of the environment, the society in which an individual lived. Judging whom to trust, forming alliances, keeping score of favors given and received, all were necessities made easier by greater cognitive ability. By 50,000 years ago, the social benefits of more efficient communication had prompted the evolution of a novel ability possessed by no other social species, the faculty of language. The human physical form was attained first, followed by continued evolution of human behavior. Anatomically, ancient humans, that is, people whose physical remains resemble the skeletons of people today, became common 100,000 years ago. But they showed no sign of the advanced behaviors that emerged 50,000 years later, probably made possible by the evolution of language. With this new faculty and the greater social cohesion it provided, the first behaviorally modern humans were able to break out of Africa and displace archaic humans like the Neanderthals, who had left Africa several 100,000 years earlier. Most of human prehistory occurred in and was shaped by the last ice age. As I said earlier, the first modern humans to leave Africa probably crossed over the Red Sea at its southern end and into Arabia and then into the steppes of Central Asia. At least one group reached Europe and slowly evicted the Neanderthals from their ancient homeland. The expansion into the cold northern latitudes of Eurasia required technical innovation and genetic adaptation to survive. Then a climate catastrophe, the return of the glaciers 20,000 years ago, emptied northern Europe and Siberia of people. Descendants of the survivors spread north again several thousand years later as the Pleistocene Ice Age drew to a close. Some of these new northerners, the Siberians in the eastern half of Eurasia, discovered the land bridge that then joined Siberia to Alaska and the Americas. Cultural adaptations of the three principal social institutions, warfare, religion, and trade, had evolved by 50,000 years ago. The ancestral human population, the first to possess the power of fully articulate modern speech, may have numbered only 5,000 to 10,000 people, confined to a homeland in northeast Africa. These ancestral people, though less cognitively advanced than people today, possessed all the distinctive features of human nature and had developed, at least in rudimentary form, the institutions that are found in societies throughout the world. These included warfare centered around a defense of territory, religious ceremony as a means of social cohesion, and an instinct for reciprocity that governed social relations within the group and trade with those outside it. Ancestral people had a major limitation to overcome. They were too aggressive to live in settled societies. Early human societies lived as small bands of hunter-gatherers, their existence dominated by incessant warfare. For 35 to 40,000 years after leaving the ancestral homeland, these nomads were unable to settle down. Only gradually did humans evolve to become less aggressive. The tempo of warfare eased, and a more gracile or delicately boned human form evolved in populations throughout the world. In the Near East, around 15,000 years ago, people at last accomplished a decisive social transition, the founding of the first settled communities. In place of the hunter-gatherers' egalitarianism and lack of possessions, people in settled societies developed a new social structure with elites, specialization of roles, and ownership of property. Humans started for the first time to produce storable surpluses of food and other products, which led to a more complex society and to increased trade between groups. Human evolution did not halt in the distant past, but has continued to the present day. The ancestral human population of 50,000 years ago differed from the anatomically modern humans of 100,000 years ago. And people today have had just as long to evolve away from that ancestral population. The human genome bears marks of recent evolution, prompted by adaptation to events such as environmental and cultural changes, or new diseases. More visible evidence of recent evolution is the existence of human races. After the dispersal of the ancestral population from Africa 50,000 years ago, human evolution continued independently in each continent. The population of the world's major geographical regions bred for many thousands of years in substantial isolation from each other and started to develop distinctive features, a genetic differentiation which is the basis for today's races. But these separate evolutionary paths were to some extent parallel, as people in different continents responded to similar challenges. People probably once spoke a single language from which all contemporary languages are derived. Just as the ancestral population, after its dispersal, diverged into different races and ethnic groups, the ancestral tongue split into a growing family of different languages. Some of these languages expanded under the influence of factors such as warfare and agriculture, so that certain language families, like Indo-European, are now spoken over large areas, while others, like many in South America or New Guinea, have a range of a few miles. Over 6,000 languages have been identified, although several disappear every year. The human genome contains excellent records of the recent past, providing a parallel history to the written record. The genome evolves faster whenever any community starts to breed in isolation, whether for reasons of religion, geography, or language. Within a few centuries, its genetics assume a distinctive signature. The compilers of the book of Genesis did their best, from available myths and legends, to frame a coherent account of human origins. They sought to address such questions as why people speak so many languages, suffer pain in childbirth, and wear clothes to conceal nakedness. Human origins can now be explained in another way. The biological framework of human origins and human nature is beginning to emerge with surprising clarity as the record of past evolutionary changes now streams forth from the sequence of the human genome. In the long search to understand ourselves, our obscure origins, our strange and contradictory nature, and the fragmentation of the once united human family into different races and warring cultures, speaking thousands of different languages, we can begin at last to comprehend the long darkness before the dawn. Although I'm certainly no expert, I'd like to take a few minutes to go over the basics of this science of genetics. And this is the point where a few of you will probably say, Tom, I already know all that. Possibly a few of you will be eager to learn something about this relatively new science, and the rest of you will probably have your eyes glazed over as you get lost in the details. The human body is made up of some 50 to 100 trillion cells, which form the basic units of life and combine to form more complex tissues and organs. We have cells in the brain, cells in the heart, cells in the blood, cells in the bone, and cells in the muscle tissue. Inside each cell, genes make up a blueprint that determines how the cell will function. Genes also determine physical characteristics or traits. The complete set of some 20 to 25,000 genes is called the human genome. Only a tiny fraction of the total genome sets the human body apart from those of other mammals, such as the chimpanzee. Most cells have a similar structure. An outer layer, the cell membrane, contains fluid called cytoplasm. Within the cytoplasm, there are many different specialized little organs called organelles. The most important of these is the nucleus. It controls the cell and houses most of the genetic material in structures called chromosomes. Another type of organelle is mitochondria, which provides energy for the cell. Containing all our genetic information, DNA is a long linear sequence of small molecules called nucleotides. There are 4 different nucleotides that constitute the double helix DNA strand, denoted by the letters A, C, T, and G. These are often referred to as the building blocks of life, and their specific order and position in the genome encodes the information carried by the DNA. Some segments of DNA carried repeated sequences of these 4 nucleotides, which constitute an individual gene, and some of these sequences can be repeated 40 or more times. Mutation is a random change in the DNA sequence that occurs as a copying mistake during reproduction. It may be the replacement of a single nucleotide with another, or the addition or deletion of nucleotides. Mutations are very rare, but given the large size of the human genome, approximately 6 billion nucleotides, children have around 50 single nucleotide mutations that distinguish them from their parents. A group of genetic lineages that share a mutation or a set of mutations is called a haplogroup. Because haplogroups are defined by mutation events that occurred at a specific place and time in history, they typically have geographic distributions that are representative of the age and scope of migration events that make up that history. I showed you such a migration pathway for my paternal ancestors on the earlier slide, where the haplogroup was R1b. About 70% of the men in southern England belong to the R1b group, haplogroup, and in parts of Spain and Ireland, that number exceeds 90%. Chromosomes carry hereditary genetic information in long strings of DNA. Humans have 22 numbered pairs of chromosomes in each cell, plus a single pair of sex chromosomes, double X in females and XY in males. This is important Women don't have the Y chromosome. It's what determines the male gender. It's been estimated that if you stretched out all the DNA strings in a human's body, it would reach to the moon and back about 3,000 times. That's a lot of DNA inside us. For most of our genome, we receive half of our genes from our father and half from our mother. Each half represents a shuffled combination of DNA passed down to us from our ancestors during reproduction. This shuffling makes it difficult to study lines of descent because it creates a genetic mix of everybody who's come before. Fortunately, there are parts of the genome that are passed down unshuffled from parent to child. In these segments, the genetic code is varied only through occasional mutations, random spelling mistakes during reproduction, and the long sequence of letters that make up our DNA. Chromosomes typically contain millions of nucleotides, so with the human body containing 50 to 100 trillion cells, the potential for diversity between individuals is enormous. These mutations are not a medical event, but a random miscopying of the parent's genetic code. Fortunately, such mutations are relatively rare in each new generation, and most of these mutations are harmless. We'll talk about the impact of beneficial mutations in just a moment. When these mutations are passed down through the generations, they become markers of descent from generation to generation. Now, what is a marker? Each of us carries DNA that is a combination of genes passed from both our mother and father, giving us traits that range from eye color and height to athleticism and disease susceptibility. As part of this process, the Y chromosome is passed directly from father to son, unchanged from generation to generation, down a purely male line. Mitochondrial DNA, on the other hand, is passed from mothers to their children, but only their daughters pass it on to the next generation. It traces a purely maternal line. By looking at the markers you carry, geneticists can trace your lineage, ancestor by ancestor, to reveal the path they traveled as they moved out of Africa. Alleles. This slide shows a definition for an allele. Colloquial usage of the term gene, that is, good genes or hair color genes, may actually refer to an allele. A gene provides the basic instruction for the trait, while an allele is one variant of that gene. When the mainstream press refers to having a gene for a specific trait, this is usually inaccurate. In most cases, all people would have a gene for the trait in question, although certain people will have a specific allele of that gene, which results in a trait variant, such as eye color or skin color. To illustrate this point a little further, this is a report of my own DNA Y chromosome testing back in 2007. This particular test was made for 37 marker genes, which are particularly good references for tracking DNA mutations on the paternal line all the way back to Africa. These 37 marker genes are shown by the red numbers and letters on the report. At the top, red, 3 lines of them. The allele, or variant of the gene that I have, is shown by the numbers in black just below, which range from 9 to 36. These allele numbers are simply the number of repeats of a particular ACTG letter sequence in that gene. These results are not unique for me, but if someone has exactly the same allele number for all 37 of these genes, it means they're likely a close blood relative. I have a third cousin in Florida who had his DNA tested about the same time I did, and he had exactly the same allele numbers for all 37 genes, which confirms that we have the same great-grandfather, as our family history shows. One of the individual results of this DNA testing is that you're provided a map of your more recent ancestral origins. This is a map of my paternal origins, which is 99% European, as expected. The highest concentrations are in the UK, Ireland, and Scotland, which confirms what my own genealogy shows about my recent ancestors. If the Y chromosome traces the male lineage back through history, then the mitochondrial DNA genome can be considered its female counterpart. Mitochondria are circular, self-reproducing structures inside cells of all higher organisms, typically present in hundreds of copies per cell. These are much smaller than the long DNA strands in the chromosomes. Because there are no mitochondria in the head of mature sperm, they are passed down solely from mother to offspring of both genders. However, as I said earlier, only daughters can pass this mitochondria DNA to her offspring. Mitochondria undergo mutations just like chromosomes, and these serve as markers on the maternal line of descent. Mitochondria are responsible for generating most of the energy used by the cell. I think it's very interesting that the energy coming from every cell in our body is inherited from our mothers. There are probably some women in the audience thinking, and why are you surprised at that, Tom? Some of you are also probably wondering if I took you through all this genetics background just to prove that DNA testing can show us all our deep ancestral roots. Well, the answer is no. There's another big reason to review the basics of DNA, genes, and alleles. And that's because these genes and alleles determine our inherited traits. And that's where recent genetics research is leading to some enlightening results and creative speculation. Here's a list of some inherited physical traits which are familiar to most of us, such as body size, skin color, eye color, and shape, hair texture, and blood type. Less familiar is lactose tolerance, or the capacity to digest lactose sugar in raw milk by adults. In most populations, the lactase gene is switched off after weaning. But in cultures that learn to herd cattle and drink raw cow's milk, namely in North Central Europe 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, there was a selective advantage from the nutrition provided by raw milk. One of the more recent known dates at which a human gene has been changed by evolution is from 3,000 years ago, when both Tibetans and Andean highlanders evolved a genetic variant that lets them live at high altitude. In Africa, a mutated gene, that is an allele, in red blood cells inherited from one parent became widespread because it protected against a parasite that causes malaria. On the downside, if an African inherits that allele from both parents, that person is susceptible to sickle cell anemia, which can be fatal. A major development of the Human Genome Project was a substantial reduction in time and cost to analyze large sections of the genome. And that's rapidly leading to testing and correlation of diseases that may be genetically related. The news today is full of possible gene therapies to help cure or control a variety of diseases, including leukemia, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and cancer. Gene therapy is the use of DNA as a drug to treat a disease by delivering therapeutic DNA made from stem cells into the patient's cells. Although early clinical failures led many to dismiss gene therapy as overhyped, clinical successes since 2006 have encouraged new optimism. Between 2013 and April 2014, U.S. companies invested over $600 million in gene therapy. I heard a TV ad the other night from a Tulsa clinic specializing in cancer treatment. They promised to test the genome of the cancer cells of each new patient to help determine which treatments are most likely to be effective. It's a brave new world out there in this field of gene therapy moves into high gear. Now we move into a more controversial and speculative area, the influence of inherited genes on social behavior. Here I'm using material from Nicholas Wade's 2014 book, A Troublesome Inheritance: Inheritance, Genes, Race, and Human History. Wade repeatedly reminds the reader that some of these genetic links are speculative, because specific genes responsible for most of these social traits have not yet been identified. He also points to the growing body of research evidence that such links exist. A large part of the problem comes from the realization that some, maybe most, inherited traits come from many different genes working together, and that's likely to be especially true for social behaviors, such as those shown on the slide. Just this past August, a Boston Center for Psychiatric Research reported over 100 genes underlying schizophrenia, 83 of which were unknown before the work done by the Human Genome Project. While some of Wade's observations about social behavior are speculative, I'll remind you that creative speculation is at the heart of innovative science, and that's what leads researchers to new discoveries in either the hard sciences or the social sciences. We should also recognize that the highest priority for such research is placed on genetic disease identification and treatment, with a lower priority for gene links to social behaviors. Aggression, the first item on the list, is one social behavior that is clearly under genetic influence, or rather the whole spectrum from aggression to shyness. Very few of the genes associated with aggression have yet been identified, because when many genes control a behavior, each has so small an effect that it's hard to detect. The other social behaviors on the list would normally be beneficial for the individual or group that exhibited them. Natural selection would tend to increase such behaviors within the family, tribe, community, and culture, and cause them to be handed down through the generations, assuming the genes have some influence here. Cooperation and trust are good examples of such beneficial social traits. The downside of this trait is that it results in mistrust once you move outside the tribe or the community circle of trust, which can lead to aggression and warfare. We'll talk about the origins and history of social behaviors over the next 4 weeks, including the development of religious behaviors. To discover that genetics plays some role in the difference between the major human societies doesn't mean that that role is dominant. Genes do not determine human behavior. They merely predispose people to act in certain ways. Genes explain a lot, probably far more than is presently understood or acknowledged, but their influence in most situations is or can be overwhelmed by learned behavior or culture. To say that genes explain everything about human social behavior would be as absurd as to assume that they explain nothing. Because we all have genes that have existed in our ancestors for the past 50,000 years or more, and those genes are being used today to track the ancestral migrations out of Africa and across the entire world, it seems reasonable to conclude that we have other genes, some just as old, that influence our social behavior. Keep that thought in mind in the next few presentations when we talk about the evolution of world civilizations, cultures, and religions. Now I want to focus for a few minutes on the drivers of genetic change and how those changes occur with the culture, along with the culture have shaped the evolution of human social structures and institutions. The next 3 slides show the main drivers of evolution. Natural selection is an evolutionary process that favors beneficial genetic mutations and limits harmful ones. Organisms that possess an advantageous trait either attract mates more easily or survive in greater numbers. Such traits are passed on to increasingly larger numbers of individuals with each successive generation. The cumulative effect of natural selection produces populations that have evolved to succeed in their unique environments. Skin color is one of the most obvious physical traits resulting from natural selection. The default state of primate skin is pale. Chimpanzees, under their fur, have white skin, although their faces are dark because of heavy suntan. When our distant ancestors lost fur, probably because bare skin allowed better sweating and heat control, they developed dark skin to to protect a vital chemical known as folic acid from being destroyed by strong ultraviolet light around the equator. The first modern humans who migrated to northern latitudes of Europe and Asia were exposed to much less UV light. Too little, in fact, to synthesize enough vitamin D for which ultraviolet light is required. Natural selection, therefore, favored the development of pale skin among people living in high northern latitudes. Pale skin evolved independently in the Caucasian and East Asian populations, showing that the two populations have remained substantially separate since they split. We know this to be the case because pale skin in Caucasians is caused by a largely different set of genes than those that cause pale skin in East Asians. The second key factor in genetic change is termed genetic drift. Each generation is a genetic lottery. Your father and mother each have 2 copies of every gene. Each parent bequeaths one of those 2 copies to you, and the other is left on the cutting room floor. It's a curious fact of genetics that one version of a gene, especially in small populations, small isolated populations, can displace all the other existing versions of the same gene in just a few generations through a purely random process called genetic drift. Consider how this might work among surnames, which are passed on from father to sons, just like Y chromosomes. Suppose 100 families are living on an island, each with a different surname. In the first generation, many of those families will only have daughters or no children at all. So in just one generation, all those family surnames will go extinct. Assuming no new male settlers arrive on the island, the same unavoidable winnowing will happen each generation until only one surname is left. That's what happened to the human Y chromosome. Every Y chromosome that exists today is a copy of the same original, carried by a single individual, the genetic atom in the ancestral human population. The Y chromosomes of all the other atoms have perished at some point along the way when their owners had no sons. The same sort of genetic drift occurred in the mitochondrial DNA, and all people today are descendants of the genetic Eve in the ancestral population. As we discussed earlier, migration is another force that shapes the genetic heritage of a species. As long as the population stays together and interbreeds, everyone draws from a common gene pool in which each gene exists in many different variants or alleles. An individual, however, can carry at most 2 alleles of each gene, one from each parent. So if a group of individuals breaks off from the main population, it will carry away only some of the alleles in the general pool, thus losing part of the available gene endowment. Mutation, drift, and natural selection are all unceasing forces that drive the engine of evolution ever onward. Even when a population stays in the same place, its gene pool or hereditary information will remain in constant flux. I want to conclude this presentation with an intriguing example of IQ development in a culture, specifically within the Jewish communities all over Europe and the Mediterranean world. As of 2007, Jews had won 32% of all Nobel Prizes, while constituting about 0.2% of the world's population. They have excelled in science, medicine, music, philosophy, art, literature, and politics. DNA analysis shows that Jews are a definable set of populations. And Ashkenazi Jews, those originating in the Levant, the eastern end of the Mediterranean, and coalescing in the Holy Roman Empire near the turn of the first millennium, can be distinguished genetically from other Europeans. They make up about 75% of Jews worldwide. On average, Ashkenazi Jews consistently show a 10% to 15% higher IQ than other Europeans, especially on verbal and mathematical questions. So what might have caused such a huge difference in average intelligence? Before the 1st century CE, Israelite religion was focused on the temple in Jerusalem and on copious animal sacrifices. The Romans destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE, which strengthened the position of the Pharisees and led them to develop a rabbinic version of Judaism in which the temple and animal sacrifices were replaced as central components of the religion by study of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. This movement emphasized literacy and the skills to read and interpret the Torah. The goal of the Pharisees was universal male literacy, so that everyone could understand and obey Jewish laws. Between 200 and 600 CE, this goal was largely accomplished, but not without difficulty. Most Jews at the time earned their living by farming, as did everyone else. It was expensive for farmers to educate their sons, and the education had no apparent practical value at the time. The Talmud is full of imprecations against boorish country folk who refuse to educate their children, and fathers are advised that on no account let their daughters marry untutored and illiterate men. So what happened to the literate sons? It's striking that the Ashkenazim, almost from the moment of their initial appearance in Europe was first recorded, around 900 CE, were heavily engaged in money lending, banking, accounting, and trade, the principal occupations of Jews in England, France, and Germany. This required a variety of high-level skills, including the ability to read and write contracts, to do arithmetic. Literacy was a rare ability in medieval Europe. As late as 1500, only 10% of the population of most European countries was literate, whereas almost all Jews were. So if the Ashkenazi Jews were engaged in a cognitively demanding occupation, it was also a highly rewarding one, and many Jews became quite wealthy. The wealth is important because it enabled Jews to secure a considerable degree of reproductive success. Before the Industrial Revolution, the rich had more surviving children, being able to provide better nutrition and warmer houses. The Ashkenazi population grew from almost nothing in 900 CE to about 500,000 by 1500 CE and reached 16 million by 1939 before the Holocaust. Because of their strong heritability of intelligence, a genetics research team in Utah calculated that 20 generations, a mere 500 years, would be sufficient for Ashkenazi Jews to have developed an extra 16 points of IQ above that of Europeans. There were, of course, Christian moneylenders who required the same cognitive skills as the Ashkenazim, but the Christians married into a much larger community that included people in many other occupations, diluting the literacy advantage. In contrast, Oriental Jews and Sephardic Jews are not overrepresented in cognitively demanding occupations, and both have IQs comparable to Europeans. This is an interesting example of a decision made by religious leaders for religious reasons that had unintended inheritance consequences for later generations of their people. It would not be the last time that happened. We'll continue this foray into the human experiment part 2 next Sunday, and I hope to see all of you here. Now, are there any questions?
Yes, hi, I'm Angela Solrin. I had a question about the genetic history of, I don't know if this is on, of Adam and Eve. You said the mother and the father of our sort of Homo sapiens genome. Right. How did they discover that? And I mean, I get where the names came from, but how did they discover that because Adam was the father and Eve was the mother?
Well, of course, they applied the name from the biblical myth, but
right.
But through the DNA analysis, they found that every man alive today has got that gene, that allele, from that first Adam. And I think he lived in
think my timing is right, he lived in Africa about 70,000 years ago. The Eve lived in, same thing occurred, that every woman today has that same genetic trace, and she lived in Africa, as I recall, something like 130,000 years ago. So they were not coexistent in time.
Okay.
I'm sorry?
Did they, are you saying because they mated? Well, that's how I don't
their descendants
understand.
met.
That's how I don't understand how, like, my brain is not connecting the dots. Like, all of a sudden there was just this man, like, did he evolve from a chimpanzee?
Well, you remember my example about surnames?
Yes.
That there were other Adams at the time,
Okay.
but they didn't have sons, or their sons died or were killed, and so that genetic trace disappeared. But the genetic trace that we all come from didn't disappear because we're here.
Right.
So, and the same thing on the mitochondrial DNA side too. So it's a trace that has persisted. We all have to come from somewhere. Let me look at it that.
So basically, his traits are the ones that survived, whereas those before, with us,
Right.
whereas those before him, if there was another Adam, his just didn't get past, his just didn't remain.
They didn't survive, or they didn't have
Okay.
sons, or they didn't pass the Y chromosome down to a later generation, or the generation didn't survive for whatever reason.
Okay, I get it.
All right?
Are we talking about two different archaeological digs where they found these remains, where they got?
These are actually not found from archaeology. This is found from the genome, the genetics research.
But they didn't actually have archaeological bones to examine.
Well, they did. In fact, they did on the Neanderthals. They've gone back and analyzed some of the DNA from the Neanderthals, and that's how they found what the DNA trace was that we have that came from the Neanderthals. I think your question is, are we tying current DNA research from modern humans back to the DNA of fossils, of anthropological fossils? And the answer to that is yes.
Okay. I thought I understood, now I'm not sure I do. We don't have the fossils of the individual who passed these traits on to current people, but we have some from that general time period.
Well,
You're asking, you have the fossil of Adam and Eve?
Right,
the answer to that is no.
right. Okay,
Yeah,
that's what I.
that's that.
Okay.
Steve?
I'm not even sure what question to ask. So, thinking through my mind, so here I am thinking about Adam. So there is an Adam or a descendant of Adam right now in East Africa that has some of the same genes, alleles that I do, and that's how we
There
trace
is,
it back to Eastern Africa.
that's right, even whether they left Africa or not.
Yes.
But the Neanderthals didn't have that that mutation. I mean, they had left Africa long before that individual, whom we trace back through a later migration out of Africa. The Neanderthals were way ahead of that, but they went extinct for whatever reason.
Why was it social behavior as the other category instead of mental? Because then you went on to explain the differences in IQ, suggesting to me that it wasn't attributed to genetics, but rather learned behavior and culture. You see what I'm saying?
That's not what I meant. I've tried to break that slide down into physical traits that are obvious. And we know that those physical traits can be traced back to certain genes. Those are the ones that's well known. The social behaviors are less obvious, and are, as Wade says in the book, and I try to make clear here, they are influenced very much by culture. So, but there is an influence of genetic inheritance in some social behaviors. He believes, and many believe, although there hadn't been very much research done on that yet. There's an interesting case here. I used one of them, aggression, I think was the first one I had on there. And there's an interesting case of 8 men from the same family in Holland, a Dutch family there. And all these men have the same variant of this Y chromosome, and they all have almost psychotic aggressive behavior. And they all have this one variant of this gene here. So it's probably not the only gene that causes aggressive behavior, but when you have that particular variation, it can, and the reason the scientists have concluded is that that gene controls an enzyme which is used to control your moods. And when it's not active, when it doesn't do that, then you go through these wild mood swings and aggressive behavior develops out of it. But that's a social behavior rather than a physical behavior like height or strength or that kind of thing. So,
But how about a mental behavior, like you spoke of the
IQ.
the Jews that
That-
have the higher IQ?
Right.
Is that attributable to learned behavior and culture, or genes, or both?
both, I'd say, both. Probably on most of these, it's attributable to the culture. But is there an element of IQ that is inherited trait? And I think what Wade is saying is that there is an element, and this Ashkenazi Jew case was an example of it. But it's very hard to detect because it's probably due to a large number of genes acting together.
I know a Presbyterian minister who studied at Perkins from Liberia, and he said that in their culture, there were some tribes that were so aggressive and warlike that they enjoyed killing just because of killing, others that were peaceful. And it was highly prohibited for one to marry out of your own tribe. From the peaceful tribe, you were definitely not supposed to marry somebody from the killing tribe. His mother, I believe, is from the killing tribe, his father from the peaceful one.
Huh.
And he was conscripted as a young man at about, I think, 14 for several years as a boy soldier. Finally escaped, but came to the United States and became a Presbyterian minister, so he must have.
Huh.
connected the mother's side.
That's an interesting, and it raises the question, you think in something like that where you got an isolated tribe that primarily breeds within itself, if there is not a genetic inheritance there. Now, obviously, if you're exposed to this kind of culture where killing is a thing to do, then it becomes a part of your cultural adaptation. But it can also, over generations, become part of a genetic adaptation as an inherited thing. And I think the point about the inherited piece of it is that is a hard, that's a hard inheritance to totally reject. You can do it, but it's hard to do. It's hard to change that very quickly by going into a different culture and then behaving totally different. It can be done. I think maybe your Presbyterian is a good example of it.